and I'm the Associate Director of the CSJ Center for Reconciliation and Justice. I always have to think about the title. It gets longer as the afternoon wears on. It's a great honor to have you all with us as we inaugurate the 2019 CSJ Symposium, which is put together by so many people, it would be hard to list all of them in the ways they do it. Many of them you're seeing right here on our panel this afternoon. I'm really pleased to be able to share with you this very important topic in relationship to homelessness. I sometimes think for some part of our society, nobody knows about it, and even worse, some people don't really care about it. So I'm really glad that we're able to focus on this this afternoon. I'm sorry to say that two of our panelists, because of unforeseen circumstances, were not able to be with us, but we have a wonderful array here of panelists. So today our moderator is Lauren Moreno, Director of the LGBT Student Service and Intercultural Initiatives. So it's wonderful to have you. And then we have with us
Mimi.
Mimi.
Mimi Hoang.
Mimi Hoang, who is with, I haven't met you before actually, and I'm sorry I didn't get to do that beforehand, with Student Psychological Services, a very important dimension of our campus, and Fred Puza, who I've known for quite some time, who brought this topic and this conversation to us to be part, he's on our planning committee, to be part of the larger picture of what we're trying to look at. We're trying to look at living on the edge and what that all means on so many facets, and also then to say who needs to be at the table and who do we need to consider in this type of a dialogue. So thank you for being here.
Great.
Thanks for the introduction, Sister Marianne. Again, my name is Fred Puza. I do community relations and ministry work at Loyola Marymount University, where you're at. We are, because of the circumstances that Sister Marianne mentioned earlier, two of our panelists, unfortunately, are unable to attend today because of personal emergencies. So I will be moderating, and I'll be moderating a conversation with Lauren Moreno and Dr. Mimi Hoang. I just want to introduce them first, then they're going to talk about their work with this population. We're going to do I'm going to ask some questions for them, and then we can open it up to any Q&A with all of you, so we can have a nice conversation today. Lauren Moreno began the role as director of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender Student Services Office and Intercultural Initiatives in July 2018. After having worked as the assistant director since 2017, prior to that, the coordinator of the LGBT SS since 2016. Lauren has since become alumni of LMU, getting their master's degree in the program of Educational Studies. Lauren also serves as advisor of the registered student organization Transcendence, which caters to the needs and developments of trans, non-binary student populations, the Gender Sexuality Alliance, and the Queer Film Club. Lauren has worked extensively within the LGBT community ever since graduating with her BA in philosophy and double major degrees in pre-law and sociology at Mount St. Mary's University, where they were acting as president of the Gay Straight Alliance for juniors and senior years. Since then, they've worked for the SEIU, USWW Janitorial Unions Education-based nonprofit Building Skills Partnership, where they acted as a program assistant for various life courses. Lauren also works extensively with the LGBT Center of Los Angeles, primarily within their youth education department, LifeWorks. They've been training with the Community Action Network of the LGBT Center for the past 2.5 years, engaging LGBT youth populations in LAUSD area in storytelling, resonance building, leadership development, and educational attainment. Lauren loves all things LGBT and education and hopes to pursue their Ph.D. in queer theory and maybe, if they're feeling ambitious, their law degree.
Yeah, why not?
Next, we have Dr. Mimi Hoang. a nationally recognized psychologist, educator, author, and grassroots activist specializing in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, and Asian Pacific Islander communities. Licensed as a psychologist since 2008, Dr. Mimi has worked primarily in community health and university counseling settings due to her passion to serve the young and underserved. Her diverse clinical experience includes API immigrants and refugees, high-risk teens, Native American foster youth, and first-generation college students. Since the 1990s, she has co-founded 3 organizations in Los Angeles for bisexual, pansexual, fluid, and other non-monosexual, aka bi+ individuals, authored multiple publications, and earned a seat at the landmark White House Bisexual Community Roundtable in 2013. She currently works as a staff psychologist here at Loyola Marymount University. She's adjunct professor for the master's program in clinical psychology at Antioch University and is a consultant trainer on diversity issues. So thank you both for attending. I want to turn it over to Lauren first to explain your relationship and interest and passion in this population and your any kind of experience that you've had working with LGBTQ homeless youth in particular.
Perfect. Hello, everybody. How are we doing? After hearing my very, very long bio. Like the whole thing. You read the whole thing. I'm impressed. In one breath, too.
Pretty much.
Yes. So my work here at LMU is predominantly within the LGBT Student Services Office here on campus in Malone 201, where all of the food is. So come get free food. We always have it. But also, outside of that, my scholarly work talks a little bit more around anime and not being associated to a particular community or a particular large subsect and seeing yourself related to things in media or in our external world, right? And what that impact has on an individual. And as a queer person myself, everything LGBTQ and everything that's queer is something that's really close to my heart. And one of my favorite things to do is working with youth, predominantly in the community. And so working with the LA LGBT Center has really provided that opportunity to work with youth who are either at risk or who are presently experiencing homelessness and helping them navigate the different resources available to them, helping them get their GEDs and do all of the test prep that they need, and just providing that space and that resource for them to fully understand their identities and how to navigate the world around us in a space that oftentimes forgets that we exist and that there are barriers to us being here because they weren't necessarily designed for us to exist. So working on deconstructing some of those barriers so that more folks can have access to education, awareness, and ideally a happy, sustainable lifestyle or life.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm thrilled to be invited to this panel. I think this topic is so unique. I don't think it's really talked about or discussed, so I just feel honored to be here. Like Freddie mentioned, I have my clinical work, which revolves around young people, children, teens, and young adults. And I, have been licensed for about 10 years, but have about 20 years of experience just in the mental health field. And I've seen a lot of different, youth in different situations. Some of my field training experiences have been centered on high-risk youth. So I interned at Children's Hospital LA several years back. And in that internship, I did several rotations at different places in Hollywood that served homeless and runaway youth. So, for example, I was at LA Youth Network, LAYN, which I think is called Youth Emerging something, YES, yes, is the new acronym. But that was a youth shelter. I also rotated at my friend's place, which was a youth drop-in center. It's a very cute name, but there was a reason that it was called My Friend's Place, so that people wouldn't know where the youth were going. They could say, I'm going to my friend's place. I was also at the LA Free Clinic that year, which served, provided free medical services and mental health services to youth under ages 25. So I also saw a range of different health issues there, and also provided counseling to youth at a group home, also in Hollywood. So all of this was centered in Hollywood, and I think we're going to be talking a lot more about that regarding the geography of a lot of these services. And so really throughout that year, it was a really interesting and challenging year. But I was able to see youth in all different stages of homelessness, from really kind of early, just having run away, to having been on the streets for years. So that, would really open my eyes to, the heartache and the tragedies that are, involved with that. We also did street outreach that year, where we strapped on backpacks filled with condoms and food and socks, and walked along Santa Monica Boulevard to provide just freebies to the youth that were on the streets. So we did a lot of different services that year. I also worked for a couple years at United American Indian Involvement in the Child Abuse Treatment Program, and we served specifically Native American foster youth. So these were youth that had been removed from their homes due to various abuse, trauma, neglect, and we were providing different mental health services and case management and court advocacy. So I also went to court with these Native American youth and tried to help them move along in their path. So I've had these experiences, and I've been at LMU now, SPS, for about 8 years. So I'm definitely seeing young adults that are in a slightly better place, but we do still have students here who are homeless or on the brink of becoming homeless, or are foster youth, and either are adopted or maybe searching for adult adoption. So there's still those experiences that are coming up now. So, but that's kind of my clinical work, and just personally for myself, I've been a community organizer for now, I think 20 years. Makes me feel so old when I say that. But, my own journey was not easy, coming out as bisexual to an Asian American family that was very strict, very traditional. And so I think through that, I really wanted to help create spaces where people feel like they belong. And so that's why I just keep creating organizations and communities.
That's great, thank you. Thanks for sharing your life and your experiences and your bios, and for agreeing to share your expertise today. I'm really excited to engage in this conversation, and I just want to again say thank you to everyone who attended today, taking time out of your days, your classes, engaging in a very important topic. So my first question is, given the recent socio-political changes and current climate, what are the issues that LGBTQ youth face today when coming out? No specific order.
So I think that there is kind of a double-edged sword, in sort of how our society's been changing and evolving and growing in its views towards, gender and sexuality. I think that there is more openness just over the years, if we're talking sort of past 20, 30 years, right? So, Ellen DeGeneres coming out, and, different TV shows and celebrities, and now politicians that are living out lives. I think that it helps young people have role models, and have that language and vocabulary of who am I, right? Oh, here's this person who identifies as bisexual or trans or genderqueer. Maybe that's me. So I think that people are realizing who they are at younger ages. For me, it took me until kind of mid-college. I grew up not even hearing the B word, the bisexual word, until I got to college. So I think young people are hearing it a lot earlier, which means that people are coming out earlier. Now, this is, I think, in some ways positive, but in some ways can leave young people more vulnerable because they're still living with their families of origin and still are dependent on their families of origin. So, you know, if their parents are highly religious, conservative, or even, you know, older brothers and sisters, then there's more of that kind of tension that happens versus someone who, like me, came out in college and I was, you know, already living away from home. I had some kind of geographical kind of protection and some time to figure out, okay, when am I going to come out to my parents? So in that way, I think there's kind of that double-edged sword. Also, I think with social media, the evolution and growth of that, how that's become such a part of people's everyday lives, right? Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, you know. There is a lot more now sharing socially, which means young people's lives are really exposed. And, you know, a lot of times the parents don't know what's going on. You know, they're not caught up, so they're not necessarily supervising and helping that young person, you know, figure out boundaries and how to say no to that bully. Because what if it's through a Snapchat? What do you do? Like, there's no trace even, right? And so bullying now is happening in that kind of technological realm where there's no adults around. It's not a playground, you know, where maybe there's a teacher. So I think that has a lot of risks in that young person's social development. And I think we hear of, unfortunately, these youth suicides. And oftentimes it's because they've been experiencing, you know, tons of bullying and harassment at school, you know, through social media and things like that. So I think that these are some of the kind of societal changes that are happening. And then I think more recently with our political administration, you know, Donald Trump, and, you know, that's awakened a lot of the bigotry that people have been politely holding back. So I think unfortunately, you know, homophobia is, you know, more people are expressing that openly and thinking that they can get away with it. So I think that's just kind of the latest development.
Thank you. Yeah, I think a lot of what you speak to is indicative of kind of this changing tide that we see, where more folks are coming out earlier on, having language, having access to information, having access to communities that they otherwise wouldn't have. And that can be a really beautiful and empowering opportunity for folks to see, oh, there's a word that makes sense to me. That's me. There are other people who make sense with that word too. And now we're like a community and we're a family. And that can be a really beautiful space. And sometimes we run into issues where that's not always the safest space, or it provides us with only a singular narrative of that particular label or that particular community. And the one person or a couple people who might not fit exactly into that label or into that community are now excluded, right, from already a niche positionality. So that's one thing that, thank you for bringing that up as well. One thing that it also makes me think of as well is if, I'm not sure how many of you have seen the TMZ report today as we talk about the actor from Empire, but that there's more access to seeing how queer people can be treated in general, right?
Do you mind sharing just in case people don't know?
Yes. So it came to my attention this morning when my coworker stepped in asking me if I had heard about what happened with the Empire Star. I'm sorry, I don't recall their name at the moment, but apparently there was a very disturbing hate crime towards this person, the young black queer man on Empire, I think in Chicago, right? Chicago, in broad daylight, was attacked by two masked men wearing MAGA hats and were bullying him, beating him up, and I believe threw bleach on him and tied a noose around his neck. And that was today in broad daylight. And this is our world. And unfortunately, we have access to that, and it's good to know what's going on in our world, right? But I don't think that the human mind or the human heart was designed to see this level of hatred or this level of bigotry towards community members. And if you're one of those individuals who maybe looked up to this person, right, of the very small niche community of black queer folks, to have this person represented and to see them on television and to say everything's going to be okay because this one person can do this, right? This one person can live out. And then to also have that returned with, this is what happens. And it kind of reinstills that message that you hear that it's not safe to be out, that it's not okay. It kind of reaffirms maybe some of the negative thoughts that you otherwise might have had, right? Those deep down internalized things that we take in and make a part of us that might not necessarily be true in reality, but the information that we've collected, the data we've collected from our experience is reinforcing those things, right? And once again, also reinforced as well are the legal parameters that have been created to protect queer communities or LGBTQ folks, and then slowly but surely are being rescinded again. And that provides also, not only are we seeing, huge stars and such be attacked in this way, but also our individual rights are being attacked, or that we're no longer being protected, or that our protection is not tangible, or it's removable, or we can take it away, or it can be gone at any point in time. And so those things really create a space of stress and anxiety on a day-to-day level where you're operating and navigating in the world and you're just trying to live your best life and maybe go to school or just get a job or have a friend. And these things are happening in the background. These things are kind of that white noise that are in your head that are consistently impacting you, and that impact the ability to continue to have hope and to have that space where you actually feel safe, or safety, right? Although not guaranteed in all spaces, or cannot be guaranteed in all spaces, is even more prevalent that it's not ever going to exist, if that makes sense for folks. Yeah, and also there's a level of, right, in social media, and I'm a huge proponent for social media. Anyone who knows me, I think it's a great tool for education and empowerment and community building if used properly. But that there's also a certain level of pressure to be out, right? If you are a queer person or you are an LGBT person, that there's pressure to be out, and not just out in one space with your friends, right? Where, I'm old enough, I think, now to say in my day, where it was customary to be out amongst your friends, and it was okay to not be out at home. Most people weren't because it wasn't safe. Where now there's a lot of pressure to be out in all spaces, and that brings into question a concept around congruence, right? Am I salient in my identity? Am I proud of my identity in all spaces? Or can I have congruence in all spaces as a queer person? And sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes we can exist in our outness in one space, and we have to for safety reasons or just energy reasons, right? The energy it takes to be out in all spaces is exhausting. Hug with consent your local queer person, because they're doing work every single day, to just be there and be present and be in that moment, right? And that there's pressure to be out in all spaces, that there's pressure to be something, to be someone, to be an inspiration to others, to be a placeholder, to be the advocate, to be the person raising their hand in class all the time about every single LGBT concept. That was me, right? So lots of, I think, pressure. I think some good things in terms of community building, but definitely a lot of things that can definitely stunt and cause more anxiety and stress for folks.
All right.
Thank you. And building off that question and also moving into the broader question of housing, some people might say, well, we have a crisis in California, in LA County, a housing crisis, so we need to focus on all people, all youth. Why do you think what's the value of paying attention to the specific needs of LGBTQ youth who might be experiencing, have had, or on the verge of experiencing homelessness?
Got a rhythm now.
Yeah, I guess I'll go first. Yeah, that's a good question because, we always, I think, get into those, well, is this like a special request, right? But the way I see it is who is more at risk, right? I think that's a better way to phrase the question, who's more at risk of becoming homeless? Or who's more at risk of, harassment, violence on the streets? It's in terms of the youth that we're looking at, in LA County or in California. I think California has the largest population of LGBT homelessness, and I think youth homelessness is what I understand. I haven't been following those statistics. So if we're just looking at LA County's needs or California's needs, we in particular have a huge, crisis of homeless youth. We kind of tried to speculate about this when I was interning at CHLA, but maybe because we do have services that target homeless youth, that this has become known. And so if you're a young person living somewhere else, someone may say, hey, did you know that, Hollywood has, all these services? So I think that that has sort of in some ways attracted more young people living on the streets to come here. The weather might be a little bit more bearable if you're someone who does not have a stable roof over your head to come to LA. And I think also Los Angeles has a certain allure to it for people who, are dreamers, right? People who are artists and creative types who are maybe coming out here with just the clothes on their backs and, $20 because they, have heard that, you can make it here in LA. You can become an actor or whatever. So I think there is something unique culturally about LA, about California and Southern California. And I think just in terms of the LGBT kind of identity and homelessness, I really was kind of thinking about this question too, is that, developmentally, I think that, LGBT youth are more vulnerable. They're going through puberty, they're figuring themselves out like any young person, but the sexual orientation and gender identity stuff is also happening during that time. So a lot is very fragile. I remember just how fragile and insecure, I was, right? If I had a pimple, right? My world is, torn asunder, right? So, but imagine, if you didn't know if your home was safe and if you were going to get beat up that day or, et cetera. So I think all of that is kind of happening all at the same time. And I also found this out recently is that, in different schools, so K through 12, there are anti-bullying sort of laws or rules. And not every K through 12 has outlawed bullying based on sexual orientation. So that means that, someone beats up so-and-so because of their race, maybe the administration is going to handle it differently than if so-and-so beat up so-and-so based on sexual orientation. And this is perceived sexual orientation, right? So if they think so-and-so is gay, because they're acting in a gender non-conforming way, because that's usually the stereotypes that people, make, right? So that also was kind of alarming to me, that there is that disparity in these K through 12 regulations. So I think that also makes LGBTQ youth more vulnerable, right? The schools are not protecting them. And then the other thing too is that, I studied sex, gender, culture, race, I love all of that stuff. I just love culture. But when you are LGBTQ, that's a cultural identity that your parents probably don't share compared to other cultural minorities, right? So think about it. If you're Black, if you're Muslim, your parents are likely going to share that, and therefore they're going to share in that struggle with you, and will support you and even maybe role model and guide you and protect you. However, if you're an LGBTQ child, your parents are likely to not be LGBTQ and are likely to be one of the people inflicting that oppression and prejudice and discrimination. So, all of those reasons, I think, make LGBTQ youth more at risk.
Thank you. And I think you bring up a good point around, addressing the most vulnerable parts of our population, of our community. When we're called to action, we are called to serve folks on the margin. We are called to do service to folks who need that support the most, right? And I think one thing that's challenging in terms of, why should we focus specifically or, maybe quote unquote special treatment to particular populations or not is not only the vulnerability, but because the needs are different. The community is different. The culture is different. The understanding and awareness and education about that population is vastly different. And I think the statistic you were speaking to, the last I checked, is around 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBT. 40 to, I think now we're closer to 45%. In terms of folks self-identifying. And that's a big number. That's almost 50. I mean, like even, 5%, 1% is a problem. But we're at 40%. That's a large population of folks, right?
Overrepresentation of the LGBT population.
Yeah. It's a definite overrepresentation. And so it's not only just about the folks who are the most vulnerable, but just looking at the numbers. The numbers are what's also informing that these are community members that need additional support, that need specific support because of the specific differences, because the community has all of these other barriers to access, right? And sometimes when we think about it, well, yeah, there's all kinds of wonderful establishments across LA that are here to support folks who are experiencing homelessness, that are here to offer beds for the night, right? And oftentimes these are religious-based organizations. Wonderful. They're doing the work. That's good. Yay. And sometimes we run into the issue where these organizations either do not support the LGBT community or that they are not looking at the barriers to access or looking at the issues to the protections of the people who are staying there, right? So not to say that that's all organizations, right? But that might be a barrier to this individual who's already dealt with a significant amount of internalized homophobia or transphobia, biphobia, any of the phobias, right? Around their identity. And now to go to an organization which generally they might not know what they're going to get. They might not know if they're going to get someone who's going to try and change their mind about their identity or try to change them, right? In order to just get services, a hot meal, maybe a shower if you're lucky. So then you're only left with, one of 3 housing options. And of those housing options, I think one of the largest centers, the Youth Center on Highland, has about, I think it's like 35 beds. They just added a couple more. They have 200 drop-ins every single day. Those are unique numbers, not repetitive folks. 200 individuals and 35 beds at a space where you know that your identity is going to be accepted and supported and protected, where you know that as a trans woman, you can go and stay in the woman's dorm, right? Instead of going to a space where you might not be safe. And not only would the organizations maybe not have those protections, but the people in the organizations, the people who are also experiencing homelessness and staying there, might not be informed. That might actually be a dangerous space for you to be in. So then your options are to try and get there early for one of the 35 beds at 3 of the places that are LGBT specific and informed. But then you also have to get there, right? You have to be one of the first people in line. You have to have that need or the ability to have access to that space, right? And the ability to advocate for yourself, right? And so we're talking about these barriers to spaces that might not support or be informed about LGBTQ folks. And so that leads these folks to fall through the cracks, right? All of a sudden, there's not really a space for them to exist safely. And then on top of that, we run into, the really exploitive nature, right? Folks experiencing homelessness, folks on the margins who are out there, right? Dealing with a lot of, mental health issues. Not only are your basic needs not met, but now you're also still dealing with your identity at some juncture, right? And so when you're facing this this challenge in your life, and the options available to you are so limited, and the world and the government and the spaces that you're in are not showing that they support you or they care about your safety. That's why we see such high rates of drug addiction, alcohol abuse, smoking in the LGBTQ community. It's not because we're really great at partying. No, it's because there's a lot of internalized stuff that happens. And oftentimes that results in folks taking drugs to then, or drinking heavily to silence those things. So now we're not only dealing with a housing issue and a basic needs issue, but now we're dealing with addiction. And then of those places, which of those deal with addiction in this context in an affirming way for LGBTQ folks, right? And I have like 20 other little notes on here, but I'll save that for later.
Great, thank you. Both of you have touched on this in different ways, but I was wondering, are there any unique variables, red flags, triggers that lead to LGBT youth experiencing homelessness? And if we've exhausted that, I have a follow-up, but...
I have additional things. Yeah, clinically, right, I think my perspective, kind of looking at, psychological profiles and, kind of reading research on what are the correlates of homophobia and what causes homophobia, right? But, oftentimes there's that high religiosity. It is kind of one of the, kind of red flags, or not necessarily red flags, but definitely, highly correlated with, kids being thrown on the streets for their LGBTQ identities. So high religiosity, usually Christianity, Catholicism. I've heard of Mormon families and, just really, very, very strict kinds of black and white. This is right, this is wrong, this is a sin, this is bad, this is a shame, not in my family. Those types of views, are what I've seen. And usually kind of related to really high religiosity and these types of views is patriarchal values and ideas, right? So the man needs to be like this and the woman needs to be like this. And anything that deters from that is, ungodly and not right and is going to bring shame. And so, those types of really, really old-fashioned views. Misogyny is usually, kind of goes along with that grab bag, where, women's views are very limited, very restricted, and, therefore I think that kind of leads to that sense of like femininity is really devalued, right? And so therefore any man that shows feminine traits, that's him devaluing himself. So those types of things, toxic masculinity basically is what we're discussing. Narcissistic or authoritarian parenting, also as well, which kind of goes along with all of that, but basically, parents that have the my way or the highway kind of views, that it has to be this way, I know what's right, I'm not going to change for you, I'm not supposed to be listening to my child because that's not the way it works, and the parents really have this maybe almost kind of like a grandiose in a way, but sort of like everyone is watching us and we can't air any dirty laundry. We have to preserve, this image of our families being this way. Usually because of church, that community, we have to present ourselves. Oftentimes it's like the preacher's kid or the pastor's child. Not in my family. This can't be done. And I think a lot of communities of color also have more conservative views around gender and sexuality. So, part of it is church, Black church, and, Catholicism's followed by Latinos, a lot of Latinos and some Asian families. But really there's that sense of, tradition and the man being this way and the woman being this way. And, in my experience, a lot of the kids that I saw on the streets that were homeless were, Black and brown kids. Conversion therapy, I think sometimes gets thrown in there as well. So these are parents that are really trying to fix their kids. So either they're physically hurting their kids because they're so angry at them, or they're sending them to some kind of conversion camp or conversion therapy, which then can create further, psychological harm. So I think, these types of really, again, very authoritarian, they're not taking into account what the kids are feeling or needing or wanting or saying or expressing, and really just, this is what, I think is right. So alcohol and drug abuse, kind of overall, in the cases I've seen where there has been documented child abuse through the Department of Child and Family Services, oftentimes there's drug and alcohol abuse in the parents. So there's already mental health stuff happening, and potentially, while the parent is intoxicated, things are getting out of control. So, these are things, domestic violence as well between the parents. So, usually we see this as well, when it's DCFS cases.
Thank you. It was very thorough. I only had a couple of extra ideas. I think I'm going to pull it back to when you mentioned in one of the beginning questions that there are students at universities across the nation, including LMU, that are experiencing homelessness, right? And I think that's often something that people forget, right? You're spending all this money in tuition, you're taking out all these loans, and not everybody has that family support when you do come out, and maybe you're in the middle of your degree, right? Or that's the thing that's keeping you, in that space, or keeping you from sharing your identity or being out, right? And so that the expense, just the general expense of being alive at this juncture is vastly more than what anyone can afford, even when you make the investment and graduate college and then leave, right? As an LGBTQ person, especially as a trans or non-binary person, to find employment, especially considering that not all states protect you from employment discrimination based on your gender identity or sexual orientation, right? That you now no longer have access to a job that you can use to pay for your rent and pay for your food and maybe even pay for your hormones or just mental health, going to therapy, anything like that, right? So in general, students and having that weight, right? That burden of all of the expenses that comes with having to go to college, and you have to go to college, right? You can't not, right? And that's now a requirement. And not only your undergraduate degree, but then you need to get your master's too, right? Because we're just going to keep on adding different degrees. And so thinking about students who are experiencing homelessness as one of the potential, variables, and one of the sentiments I gather from students, and I also experienced in my own undergrad degree, was an anxiety that at any point in time my parents could pull funding from me if I did something that they did not like, right? And that's once again another stressor. Some other red flags, I think you mentioned most of them, but thinking about self-harm, addictive behavior, anxiety, and any kind of extreme, right? So if we're extremely, out and about, and we're always out and about, and we're always, partying and having fun, that's an extreme. That might be a variable of something deeper going on. Or if you have the extreme of, I'm never going out, I'm in my house all the time, and I never leave, and I don't talk to anyone. Also another extreme to be mindful of in terms of looking at red flags. But I think family unit, support, access to different things is also variables as well. And I think you brought up a really good point around cultural connections and religious connections as well, and sometimes those two things are intertwined. I was raised Catholic. I went to Catholic my whole life, except for 3 years I went to public school. I don't know what that was about, but my whole life been raised in Catholic doctrine, and it's very salient in my identity. And that sometimes there are more opportunities in those spaces to have negative experiences, right? For me, it was the confirmation process when they ask you that question on, do you denounce your homosexuality, right? They only asked me, no one else. But those opportunities kind of, once again, reinforce and reinstill. And that's not all faith-based spaces. There are some really great churches and faiths that are doing amazing work with our community. So I don't want to isolate those folks because they're out there. But that, that can definitely be a variable, right? If we're in spaces where we're constantly hearing the same message, if we're constantly hearing that we're vulnerable, or that we are at risk, or that the story of who you're going to be when you grow up is, these three things, that slowly starts chipping away at you. That slowly starts becoming the only thing that you could ever aspire to be, are these statistics of who you are these stories of who you are these movies, right? So a hyper awareness of those things would also be an indicator, right? Of seeing those internalized messages, of believing that to some degree that you're not worthy of more, of being more than that statistic, or having things that you otherwise would have thought that you couldn't have, right? Like a wedding or a kid or what have you, right?
Lauren mentioned the high percentage of homeless youth that are LGBT. Within that population, the most vulnerable population is the trans community. In order to get housing, you have to have a job, but yet trans youth have a hard time gaining employment. So in your opinion, why is it so hard for trans youth to gain employment?
You want to go start? Okay.
Breaking the mold.
Yeah, we're switching it up now, keeping you on your toes.
You on your toes, everyone.
So I face this a lot with students who are graduating, some of our trans students, some folks that I've worked with in the community. Employment is a really big issue. Not only because not in all spaces or in all organizations or companies are you protected from discrimination as an LGBTQ person or as a trans person or someone who's gender nonconforming, but also for the fact that there are people in these spaces completely unaware of maybe some of the biased decisions that they'll be making, right? Some of the technical jargon that we hear would be, oh, they're just not a good fit for this organization. What does that mean? Tell me more about that. What does a good fit look like? Does a good fit look like someone who is subscribing to a gender presentation that you would expect of them? And maybe that's something that's a barrier, right? So there are these implicit biases that employers might potentially likely have, because we are all a part of the same society, the same messages that we receive about who we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to be, what we're supposed to look like, what is even professional dress. I have this conversation all the time with some of my students, and the notion of deconstructing what professional means. What does professional look like? Who determines what professional is? And as queer folks, with our queer bodies, oftentimes we don't look the way that people want us to. We don't subscribe to that. And because of that, we often are left with either people who are really anxious around us and don't know how to navigate us as people. Just say hi, we're fine, it's okay, right? Or that don't want to deal with that in their workspace. They don't want to have that conversation about your pronouns, right? I'm a grown person and I still have a hard time advocating for my pronouns sometimes in certain spaces where it's just exhausting, right? Or that I have to remind people about my pronouns because I look a certain way and they expect a certain, designation from me. And so there are these biases that occur within the employment process, right? And just not even talking about the legal parameters, but that the person who is doing all of the interviews is maybe unaware of the community, unaware of how to talk to this person, maybe because they've never experienced or interacted with a trans or non-binary person before. And so then it becomes something of stress for that person, right? Which then relays back to this other individual, right? You imagine sitting in an interview room and the person keeps messing up your pronouns, right? Similar to when, someone would say, "Oh, you're very articulate for a young Mexican-American person. That's nice of you. You look at you using big words." That's uncomfortable. That'll throw anyone off their game when they're in the middle of an interview. So then all of a sudden that's now a barrier too. Because now I'm not doing well in this interview because I'm freaking out because my pronouns have been misused 5 times. And that's already an indicator that this isn't going to be a safe place to work. And not only that, right? So let's say we get past the interview and you got the job. Yay. How do we talk about benefits? How do I ensure that my hormone replacement therapy is going to be covered? How do I make sure that I don't out myself if that's not what I want, right? What are some of these things? How do I make sure that this is going to be a safe place for me to be? Not just safe in the context of like my feelings aren't getting hurt, but like actively safe as a human being going to and from work, going to the market, right? Or the grocery store. No one really calls it the market anymore. Going to the grocery store, right? Going into a conference room. And I think sometimes some of these implicit biases that employers might have are associated around how are clientele going to receive this person? Am I now going to have to deal with another litigation issue because a client has now misused pronouns or said something derogatory to my employee? How do I address that? So a number of things are barriers to access to folks, right? Not only that, but finding clothes to even wear that fit you, that you can afford, that make you feel comfortable and confident in your own skin, right? In a space where you're expected to look a certain way and be a certain way.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is documents and ID, right? So if you're a trans youth, you're likely not having, sort of started that transition. And so your documents aren't going to match. And so, when employers are asking for your ID, asking for your resume, which name do you use? I have known of trans college students who, maybe they started hormones, maybe they've started socially transitioning, but they haven't changed, their documents. And so when they're even doing things like scheduling doctor's appointments or whatnot, they have to use their legal name. Or not, maybe they use their new name, but maybe their voice still sounds feminine or masculine or whatnot. So then that might also throw off, employers or other professionals. So things like also high school transcripts, right? If a young person has become homeless, they're probably not going to school, they haven't graduated, there's all those types of, barriers there. And then I think also if you have started hormones as a trans person, but you've become homeless, or you are homeless and you just don't have a stable place to keep your medication or the wherewithal to take your medication or hormones regularly, right? So all of that can also create a lot of disruptions, gender dysphoria. That trans person just isn't feeling their best. They don't feel like they look their best or feel their best. And then that's going to affect how they perform in that interview.
I have a few more questions, but I know we're getting short on time. So does anyone have any questions out in the audience? Yeah.
Is one of your questions how to address the issue of homelessness in this population or solutions?
What was the last part of the question?
Well,
Did everyone hear it?
I don't want to
No, please, yeah.
off the agenda, but it's always nice to be able to come out of something knowing what you can do or what potential solutions and resources are, and I didn't know if that was going to be addressed, or if you could address it.
Did everyone hear that?
Definitely. Thank you for keeping it strength-based. I'm a fan.
Yes.
I'm a fan of always, right? Because sometimes with these panels and these discussions, it can actually just be super draining because then you're hearing like all this negative stuff and you're like, well, what am I going to do now? I'm just going to go watch Netflix and like hide in like my comforter. That's what I'm going to do, right? That's good self-care. Sometimes you need to. It's fine, right? Come out of your cocoon later. Yes. So the question was if we can address what some of the action steps that we can take, some of the solutions to resolving this issue of LGBTQ homelessness, right? And definitely a big question. I'd love to form some sort of like task force. I'm all about the committees. But I don't want to steal the mic. Do you want to go first? No? Okay. No?
You have the mic.
Okay, I'll do it. I'll do it. Here we are. And so I don't profess to know the answer to your question in terms of that there's this one thing that we can all do and this is the solution, because if that was the case, then we'd have a solution and everything would be great. But some action steps and best practices, I think, is something I can definitely offer. A lot of what we're talking about is really revolving around our societal preconceived notions about the LGBTQ community. And over these past 10 years or so, education around the LGBT community has increased. And we're seeing, good news, I have a good statistic for you, not an exact statistic, but I have a good note, that we're seeing that all of that education and training and awareness and media representation is actually increasing the way that people feel about the community, their awareness of the community, what kind of demystifying a little bit about what that means, right? So a decade ago, we were shrouded in this space where no one knew anything about the community, and it was all really scary, and people were unsure, and there was all kinds of stereotypes associated. And some of those stereotypes still are associated in certain spaces, right? I think some of what we can do, right, is increase our own education, right? Utilize the resources that you have at your disposal, right? LMU is in a wonderful place. We have so many resources, a very well-resourced campus. There are spaces and people here who can connect you to resources externally, right? Or help you have that conversation, or help you support a friend, right? I've had multiple, faculty members, staff members, even students come to me saying, I'm noticing this thing with my friend or my student or my family member, what have you. And I don't really know what to do about it. I'm noticing, some things that are an issue. They're sleeping in the library for weeks on end. Why aren't they staying in their dorm? Where are they, right? How can I help this person, right? So my job is there to say, okay, well, let's see what resources we can get this person, or that you can extend to them, or that we can bring them in and I can talk to them, right? So just be mindful of where your folks are at, where your people in your communities are at. Be aware that not everyone is going to identify in the way that you think that they're going to, right? Let's not make assumptions about people. The same way you wouldn't want anyone to make an assumption about you by the way that you look or talk or what have you. Same goes for our community, right? We're big on no assumptions, right? Think of ways that maybe your organization, right? Maybe you're in a club, or maybe your department even, maybe in your job, that there might be some barriers to access for LGBTQ folks in terms of employment, right? That's a really big one. What are some things that you can see now, having attended this panel and heard some stuff, right, that you can go back and take with you? Every single person here is an agent of change. We all have the opportunity to make that change. Even the tiniest little thing, like adding a preferred name section on a roster, is a huge change for someone, right? Maybe you introducing yourself with your pronouns, something super small, but it's slowly chipping away at the way that our society views sexual orientation and gender identity, right? Little by little, these things start chipping away, right? Small, tiny action steps that all lead to a bigger change. Be aware of the policies that are going on around you, of the measures that are coming out of our even local government that might impact, and ask them, how is this going to impact XYZ community? I get all kinds of calls during election time, and people will be like, oh, you vote for so-and-so. And I'm like, okay, tell me a little bit about what they have done or what they're going to do for my community. And if they can't answer that, say, I'd really like you to look into that because people are going to ask, and it's important. Right? Even something like that, all of a sudden now there's a tiny little note about the community on this person's paper that's going to get to someone else, and eventually it'll come back. Right? Another big one, this will be my last one, is pay them, give them monies, right? There are wonderful LGBTQ activist organizations, artists especially, right? All over the place. Buy their art. Venmo them some cash, right? Venmo's super easy. Provide them with that agency and that opportunity, right? Even like $5 to a random person. Sometimes I like Venmo someone like $5. I'm like, here you go. Seems like you're doing some good work. There you go, that's $5. You can do what you want with it. It's different than buying a gift card or something that limits them to that space. Let them have the autonomy and the agency and the economic ability to make those own determinations for themselves. And you'll always be surprised how much those little things make a difference to people. Right? Support their art. Bring people into the community to hear their stories, to support their organizations, right? Like their stuff on the social medias, right? Share their artwork. Share their story. Little tiny things that can make these adjustments. Right. Now on to some bigger policy things.
Thank you for asking the question, and I also can't say that I know all of the answers. I think the fact that we're even having this panel today is groundbreaking. So I really thank Freddie and the center for having this, because we need to just even start talking about it, right? Even start saying homeless LGBTQ youth. Money, Lauren brought up, I think is one avenue. And if you can't do anything else, let's say your life is just busy or you don't know what to do, donate money. Donate money to causes and organizations that are doing this. I have friends who are self-proclaimed pocketbook liberals. They're like, I don't have the time, but, I'm at a place where I have some money, I can send it somewhere. It's a multi-level process, right? Any kind of systemic change is going to take time, and it's going to take many people operating at many levels. So there's macro, right? Laws, policies. If you're an attorney, if you're someone in the legal field, you can start tackling those things. Defending folks who need defending, or really going out there and changing laws, becoming politicians, right? There's prevention, in terms of, looking at the situation and what the need of that community is. If you do nonprofit work or health, policy, things like that, you can look at prevention, and then you can look at intervention, right? So it's sort of at different stages. And where do you feel like your skills and your time could be best allocated? Prevention would be changing ideas, right? Changing those really old, outdated, toxic, and traumatic ideas and values that say, being LGBTQ is bad. So those types of programs that target families at a local level could be schools, churches, YMCAs, those kinds of things. Even doing movies and videos, right, can be a way to target and share stories, in a way that's maybe indirect, that can also help change people's ideas. And then there's like early detection, and there's intervention for when the situation gets, more sort of complicated. And so if you want to, join organizations that actually help these homeless youth, right? I've mentioned a couple of them. Obviously the youth center at the LA LGBT Center. My friend's place, there's Covenant House, that's also a youth shelter in Hollywood, the LA Free Clinic. CHLA has, several programs that are helping in their adolescent medicine program. They have a trans youth program that's amazing. LifeWorks is the youth division of the LA LGBT Center, and they do great programming all year round. But there's also a conference called Models of Pride. That is an annual conference for LGBTQ youth under age 25. It is a free one-day conference, and youth from all over come to this. It's usually at USC, I think.
It's at Cal State LA.
It's also, okay, it's at Cal State LA now. And there are workshops for the youth, there's workshops for families, and there's workshops for professionals. So, you can go, or you can go and lead a workshop if you're passionate and you have something to say. You can have a resource table. But, these are different organizations that are really targeting and doing that intervention work, providing healthcare, providing job skills training, helping with trans folks get documents, all of that stuff. So, I think it's just, you can't do everything, and I think people can easily get very overwhelmed. I know myself, I do. I'm like, okay, API issues, queer issues, immigrant issues, undocumented, there's just so many, right, all the time. But, we have to take care of ourselves too, right? We still need to eat and sleep and, try to be coherent people. So one thing at a time, and figure out what you're most passionate about and where your skill set would be best allocated.
I just want to throw my 2 cents in there. I think that my policies always start locally. So if there are homeless services in your area, make sure that they have LGBT services. A lot of times people think, well, if you're LGBT and you need services, then go to West Hollywood or go to the big centers that serve this population. So making sure there's access from wherever you live. And then in my opinion, the path to liberation is at the policy level. So for instance, like LAUSD is having a special election right now, and a lot of what's going on that's on the table is the bullying, but also enforcement of the anti-bullying. So nominating and electing politicians that will really enforce these policies, and that's when we'll, in my opinion, that will happen. Will you please join me in thanking Lauren Moreno and Dr. Mimi Hoang for the panel discussion today, and thank you all for attending, and be sure to join all the other seminars in the symposium at the CSJ. Thank you. Did you want to say something, sister?
Just one quick. I want to second the thank you, and just for providing the conversation. I think community said just even having the conversation and talking about it in an open forum around an issue that all of us would say is a huge issue, I think are some first steps. What I would say is to continue the conversation and to also figure out, how do we take a look at the dignity of every person as they are trying to develop to the best of their potential. And what is our role in that, especially as a religiously based and ethically based university? How do we help people tell what they truly believe to be their own story? And it's fraught with some challenges. However, I think it's a very necessary kind of conversation to have if we believe in inclusivity. Thank you.
Thank you.